Welcome, ladies and gents. This is Emmet, the host of the Resolving Reality podcast and the author of the book Red Pandemic, The Global Marxist Cult. Back with another series of live streams, interviews, some other bits and pieces as well. So if you wouldn't mind, please do like, subscribe, share this content, and drop your comments down below as well. Your support is greatly appreciated. So in today's show, I'm honoured to be speaking to a very popular and excellent speaker, author, analyst. He's regarded as a bit of an expert in Marxism, or what some people call woke or liberalism, etc. So without further ado, I'll bring on my guest, Mr. James Lindsay. James, good evening. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you.
No worries. Great to speak to you. And I actually did speak to you about a couple of years ago. It was on an Irish X space. I was brought in as like a kind of a guest interviewer because there's so few people in Ireland who know anything about Marxism, so I could kind of speak the language. A lot of people really enjoyed the conversation, and I know a lot has happened in the world since then. I know you're doing some great work, and I really enjoy your videos. For the viewers, the website is newdiscourses.com, and the YouTube channel is also New Discourses. Just to kind of start us off here and introduce you to the audience. I know you have an academic background, you're a mathematician and so on, but how did you kind of get into this subject? Like, what was the motivation for you to start studying into Marxism?
It's actually kind of a winding road. It doesn't make a ton of sense unless you've lived it. But after I finished my PhD in 2010, which is in mathematics, like you noted, I got out of academia and I had no particular interest in going back to academia. And I started to get involved to have a kind of an academic or an intellectual outlet in the new atheist movement, as it was. So I studied the philosophy of religion. I studied what these new atheists had to say. I kind of read both sides of that perspective. And I studied philosophy of science, which I actually thought was more interesting than the philosophy of religion. I eventually started studying psychology of religion, and I thought that was also very interesting. And I kind of got this basis for writing some articles. I had one in Philosopher's Magazine. I've got one in Time Magazine, Scientific American, and so on. I was writing with Peter Boghossian, who became a good friend of mine, philosopher from Portland State University. And he was beleaguered at his extraordinarily woke university by what we would recognize as woke today, by the diversity office, as it was generally called, and the extremely left-wing culture there in Portland, Oregon. And I was experiencing this online. And of course, we were writing together. So we would be on the phone together once in a while, a few times a month probably, and just talk through some of this stuff. And it became increasingly alarming to the point where we were tracking, recent publications out of what I call now the theoretical humanities. So gender studies, critical race theory, and so on. And, just there's this sort of madness there in the mid 2010s. People were paying attention and seeing this kind of madness coming out in the academic journals, seeing it in the conference spaces, academic conferences, and this new atheist space was being eaten up by it. So Peter and I got interested in saying something about it, and nobody wanted to hear what we had to say. We were told we didn't have degrees in it. We were told that we were white men and therefore couldn't offer a valued opinion on it. And so we thought, what are we going to do? And Peter had the idea that it would be great to deliver an academic hoax to them. So, I mean, it's its own long story that I've had to tell probably like 5,000 times now. But the long and short is, from late 2016 through late 2018, we engaged in what was originally called the conceptual penis as a social construct, which was a prank we did with an academic paper, which rolled into what's become known as the grievance studies affair. And so this was my first real look to do the grievance studies affair. We had to really we didn't survey the literature. We didn't look at the abstracts and make fun of the papers or read one here and there. We actually had to look into this. What do these people really think? What do they really believe? I'd read a little bit of it to try to criticize it, but nothing in incredible depth. And I started to study it very deeply to write those papers, and it's completely wacky. I thought this was all very funny, and we were going to expose something, and we'd all have a good laugh, and maybe it'd make a difference. But about halfway through, we were submitting peer-reviewed journal papers, right? So we were writing academic pieces, full-blown academic articles for peer-reviewed publication, and we're sending them to peer-review journals. And the peer reviewers would therefore write us back commentary on our drafts. And so one of them was about education, and suggested that the paper that we had written suggested that we would basically take privileged students, identify who they are in classrooms, and abuse them to help them get over their privilege, and to teach them about oppression. And the peer reviewer wrote back that this was a great idea. Now, to make it funny, we said that we would use compassion while we did it. And so we're going to abuse the students, but we'll be compassionate. And the peer reviewers actually said, this is the right model. You have the right theoretical background, which was overcoming white fragility and this kind of thing. Literally, we found out about Robin DiAngelo before almost anybody had ever heard of her, like 2 or 3 years before anybody knew who she was. So we framed that paper around white fragility. And they said, oh, yeah, that's all right, but you can't use compassion because that puts the needs of the privileged students first. It recenters their needs. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is not funny actually anymore. It stopped being funny pretty much. I started thinking about it, and maybe I was exaggerating the threat, and maybe I don't think I was. Is that this is the kind of logic that unravels civilization and threatens, possibly even genocides. You are going to teach people based on their immutable characteristics of who they are, their race, their sex, and things like this. You're going to identify them as having a stain called privilege that you're going to re-educate them out of. And if it doesn't work, what do you do? Well, the problem persists and you have to solve the problem. So nothing good happens here. The dehumanization program is there. But when they said compassion is off the table, given that their whole thing is sold to us as like compassion, I thought something must really be wrong here. So I quit my job. I asked my wife if I could quit my job and dedicate all of my time and effort to studying what I believed I had a bit of a head start in. Nobody was talking about it. Nobody really understood it. There were just some fringe characters on the internet that were interested. And I thought the world needs to know about this. And I'm going to have a vehicle once this project comes out, once the grievance studies thing goes out. I mean, we were predicting it was front page of the New York Times territory, and it did make the front page of the New York Times on October 5th, 2018. So I knew I was going to have the opportunity to speak about what I was finding, and there were different ways to do it. And one was to talk just about the joke, which is what everybody really wanted. And the other was to talk about this more serious concern. And I just started pouring all my energy into studying it. I wrote a book with Helen Pluckrose, who also did this project with us, to showcase what we learned without talking about the prank. And it's called Cynical Theories. Been very lucky that book took off very successfully in 2020 when it was published, just after George Floyd died. It was published that summer, and it took off, and it's now reached it was sold over 500,000 copies. So I don't know how many hands it's wound up in, maybe as many as 1 million hands at this point. It's in 30 languages. It's all over the world. I've been invited to speak on that book in other countries, and because it's been published in those other countries, it's very exciting. In countries that don't speak English in particular, which is even more interesting and exciting. So that research just never stopped, right? And I just kind of kept going deeper. At some point, I was compelled to read the critical theorists, not just the postmodernists, as we covered in Cynical Theories. And of course, this is a post-Marxist milieu. You know that these are leftist thinkers. Eventually, you're going to get to the critical theorists, and you're going to get to the Marxists. And lo and behold, that's what I did. And I realized that there's an arc of continuity, very much like the same way that there's an arc of continuity across evolutionary forms and animals. That if we say that birds today are the modern descendants of dinosaurs, they obviously don't look a lot like dinosaurs, but there's this continuity there. And so what I see as this so-called woke idea that the left has been destroying our civilization with for the last decade or two in Western countries. I see a direct evolutionary pathway, and can kind of track how it developed all the way back from Karl Marx or even earlier, but then going forward through the Eastern-Western Marxist split in the 1920s into the developments of the 1960s, into the more the postmodernist developments of the 70s and 80s going into the 90s. And then these, like, we called it applied postmodernism in Cynical Theories, but woke, frankly, critical constructivist thinking into the early 2000s. So I can trace this evolution pretty clearly. I can give a plausible account for why these evolutionary leaps had to occur in order to infect a Western host, steeped with the particulars of history that it has. And that's how I got interested. That's what I've done with it ever since, and I just haven't stopped.
That's brilliant, James. Yeah, it's fascinating, and actually, I think that kind of probably happens to a lot of people. You know, you start to see more and more of this stuff, and then you can't help but kind of delve into it. For those of us who are kind of capable, and say, I know this isn't all about politics and so on, but like, you know, I thought perhaps, I think from what I know of you, you've identified a kind of like a liberal, or a classic liberal, should I say. Is that what was part of your kind of reasoning as well? Because I've heard that a lot with Americans sometimes, that anything that's going to encroach on rights and constitutional rights is obviously going to cause the alarm bells to go off. And certainly Marxism, whichever form it takes, is definitely totalitarian. Was that part of your reasoning as well, that you're kind of like, say, a classical liberal, and this was kind of a threat to your beliefs as such?
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely the case that this is a belief system that requires consent and affirmation, and maybe to some of the propositions I would be interested in giving consent or affirmation, and to others I wouldn't, and I don't feel like I'm going to be compelled. So the motivation for me to want to take this on was strikingly American in that sense. You know, this classical liberal tradition. I also, just as a point of reference, I was raised in a scientific home. My father's an engineer, and then you know, so he impressed upon us the importance of the sciences. He impressed us with the sciences so much that my brother and I, growing up, I just have the one brother, but my dad told us, and I think he meant it. I've never been totally sure if he meant it or not, but he told us that if we majored in the humanities when we went to college, we were disowned. Not only would he not pay for college, which wasn't really on the offer for us anyway, we would be disowned from the family if we majored in the humanities. So when I told my dad I was going to major in physics, it was like literally we had an argument, because my dad didn't think physics was practical enough. And so that was, you know, this is the kind of, so I was raised in that environment. I knew Newton's laws in kindergarten. I understood the processes because my dad worked in aluminum smelting. I understood the processes of aluminum smelting and electrolysis, and, you know, the necessity of molten electrolytes and things like this as a grade schooler. So then I go off and I major in physics, and, you know, I get this scientific training, and then I decide I don't really like physics as much as I thought, but I finished the degree and to go off into mathematics. And so rigorously logical, not a whole lot of baloney happening or BS happening or fudging it happening in mathematics. I mean, you're playing in strict axiomatic spaces. What they call axiomatic systems is what mathematics actually looks at. And there's not a lot of room for this nonsense. And so it was an affront to my very thinking that people would think this way. And then, you know, you go a couple steps further down the line, and I wasn't really particularly alarmed by this stupid, like my dad was going to disown me if I went into the humanities. Therefore, who cares what the humanities are doing? They're stupid. And so that's what kind of the mentality that I had as a scientist. You know, many scientists are chauvinistic about their science background. And so I go into it looking at it this way, don't think much of it. And then the paper that got us to write the real paper that got us to write the grievance studies affair, false papers, hoaxes, or whatever you want to call them, was a paper that was going after the science of glaciology. I don't have any particular love for glaciology. I don't dislike glaciology. I don't care about glaciology. It's an interesting and important science, I'm sure, to study ice and its progression and recession. I don't care about the details. But what I saw was an incursion into the harder sciences by this lunatic philosophy. If you want to go do lunatic philosophy in sociology or whatever, I suppose that's probably bad, but whatever, I don't care that much. I had that kind of attitude in the 2010s. And then I was like, wait a minute, you have no jurisdiction here, basically. Get out. And the thing is like, no, that's your privilege. This is all very masculinist. You just don't want women around. It's like, no, you suck at science. Like, we don't want people who suck at science around. It's a very different thing. So I was that was like the kind of immediate, you know, irritant that pulled me into looking at it. And so much of my work since has been like people, I see something, I think it's wrong. I'm like, that's stupid. People are like, you've never read it. And I'm at this point now where it's like, listen, brother, you don't want me to read it. I haven't read it yet. I know it's bad. If I read it, I'm going to find out why it's bad. And I'm going to tell everybody in unbelievable detail. So you're better off just not provoking me here. And this is borne out many times in many domains. I'll just say that. But yeah, that scientific background and the classical liberal philosophical background, I've always had this, very strong belief in the American kind of program. Politically speaking, I thought, I grew up American. I grew up proud to be an American. I grew up, properly brainwashed into believing, and I think it's true, actually. I'm just joking with my phrasing there. I grew up believing that the Americans had devised a unbelievably good system for dealing with the realities of human nature and politics, and that maybe is not perfect, but is second to none. So, I had that as a basis as well. And it made a huge difference in how I saw this Marxist stuff. Marxism has no place in the American psyche. I've lost your sound, Emmett.
Oh, sorry, my mistake. Yeah, it's very interesting hearing the genesis of your thought here, and I mean, your dad was absolutely right about the humanities. When you think about what they've become, they're just a breeding ground for all of this stuff. And interestingly, just as a side tangent, you look at a country like, say, Sweden, which was hit quite early with all the mass immigration and all the leftist policies and such. In a country like that, even there, where the feminists have been well entrenched for decades, they were trying to force the males into or trying to force the females into the STEM subjects, and even there it didn't quite work because they're certainly different. It's hard to shove Marxist theories into engineering and stuff like that. I'm sure they'll try, but with the kind of liberal thing, whenever I think of the States, James, I always think that I wonder if it's kind of an obstacle when people use the term liberal, because obviously there was classical liberalism. And then there was the modern, people use the term in the modern terms, they really mean Marxism. And I think I've noticed that a lot myself. I mean, I'm sure you've dealt with this a hell of a lot more than me. So why is this kind of problematic, do you think?
No, you're exactly right. The term liberal, just to use a fancy term for it, has been completely deracinated, which means pulled out of its roots. Like, it doesn't mean what it used to mean. I don't think it's a recoverable term. I cringe a little bit even when I hear it brought up anymore. I don't try to recover the term. I don't come out, as I did for many years, with this crusade for recovering the proper understanding of what liberalism is in the classical liberal sense. I've kind of given up, and I just kind of look behind it. I found it's much more productive to talk about the principles that were recognized collectively as classical liberalism, and look at those principles individually, which does allow, maybe these people have a point. Maybe technology or the circumstances have changed, especially with social media, to where this, late 18th century political model isn't exactly ideal. And maybe they're right. In fact, they are right that there are certain aspects of the European Enlightenments and even some aspects of people like John Locke that are sort of, not firmly grounded philosophical thinking. But on the other hand, there's obviously something worked. And it's, I think, smarter, while, people like Jefferson, writing in the U.S. Declaration of Independence, drew from Locke. Locke said that the foundation of a free society would have to be securing the inalienable rights to life, liberty, and property. And Jefferson famously transcribed that as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in the Declaration of Independence as inalienable rights given to us by our Creator. While all that track is nice, there's something that's very harmonious between the scientific mindset that I kind of grew up in and was educated in, and then this kind of classical liberalism that I would believe in, which is this sort of universality. Sometimes Christians refer to this as seeing what they say is general revelation. The world is out there. We can see the world. We could call this realism, which I actually prefer to call it, that the world actually is out there and we can actually go for ourselves and perceive the world. And you and I can do that separately, and we can compare notes. We can agree and disagree freely on what we've observed and what the meaning of what we observed happens to be and how important that is. But we each and all have the capacity to go out and observe the world for ourselves, to do the experiment in the scientific language. Sometimes it's just make observations. That's called universality in science. And it's just, if you get bogged down and say the Enlightenment is crap because of Descartes or Kant or whoever else, you've kind of missed a very important part of the picture here. This idea of scientific universality is true. That which is true, if we believe that there is an external world that is objective and it's out there regardless of what we are as subjects, then it's the same truth for every person or every entity that can interact with it. So therefore, if we each go look on our own, we should be able to see the same thing, and then we can compare notes and work out what that is and what that means, what we have seen, what we've missed, and so on. But this is the same idea that the US philosophy is more firmly based on than somebody like John Locke, which is this idea that's called common sense realism, which was originally part of the Scottish Enlightenment, and it was actually directly rejecting the European Enlightenment. If you read Thomas Reid, who was instrumental in the common sense realist program, when he writes in Inquiry into the Human Mind, he starts off just literally making fun of, not even engaging, making fun of Descartes. Just making fun of him. He's like, oh, Descartes says, cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am. So because he doesn't know for sure if he exists. And it's like he goes to the story when he knows he exists when he goes and does his daily life. He just makes fun of him. Then he makes fun of John Locke for making it worse. And so he makes fun of all of these, even the English Enlightenment, but then you get into especially the European Enlightenment, he's making fun of these guys. He doesn't take these guys seriously at all. He thinks that they're making a grand mess of everything. And that common sense, which kind of bled into pragmatism and other things in the American tradition, that common sense is at the heart of the experiment that I actually support. It coheres perfectly with what's called universalism or universality within the scientific approach. And so I think that coherence is meaningful. I think that that's correct. And so I like to get back to these earlier principles. I do believe, as the classical liberals do, that we have inalienable rights, whether those come from creator or not. That's a great way to put it. But the basis for those rights, at the very least, is that because each of us is equal in dignity, equal in distance to the deity, if he exists or not, doesn't matter. We're all equal in distance to the deity, because as a mathematician, I'll tell you the distance from any finite amount, which is us, to an infinite amount is the same. It is infinity, always. Doesn't matter how big or small the number is. The distance from the number 2 to infinity is infinity. The distance from the number 1 trillion to infinity is infinity. Or as one of my math professors used to like to say, all numbers are smaller than most, which is the more you think about it, the more fun and profound that statement is. All numbers are smaller than most. So anyways, because of that, we have these inalienable rights based on just the principle that nobody has the authority to alienate us from our rights. Nobody has some special position from which they are more entitled to be able to interact with the world than we are. And so once we get to that position and we can accept this type of equality thesis, literally, which is not the radical equality thesis of Marxists or the egalitarian thesis of the French Enlightenment. It's a different equality thesis. Is that none of us we're all equal in intrinsic, implicit, a priori authority over one another, which is to say none, with the only exceptions being when people are not capable, say, of what we would call power of attorney. Children, their parents have authority over them, or people acting in loco parentis, and the mentally incapable have to be taken care of. And so we understand that there are exceptions that don't violate the rule. But that said, none of us has any special authority over anybody else. And therefore, we all have a system of inalienable rights, and we set up a government to protect those rights primarily. And the American experiment's about self-government, so that people can engage in those observations and experiments for themselves without the state saying, well, don't look there, that's inappropriate, or the church saying, you can't ask that question, that would be heresy. And so, we can get back behind this classical liberal label, but all the stuff that means classical liberalism falls out without all of this baggage, just by taking on some pretty basic assumptions like the world is out there and we have eyes and brains. and therefore are able to observe and process our observations for ourselves. We're also all communicative. Therefore, we have the ability to discuss what we've observed. And if we want to, on the presupposition that we're all limited and finite, therefore prone to make mistakes, we should invite discussion. Therefore, we should discourage violence against one another over disagreements so that we can have those discussions and blah, blah, blah. And the whole system falls out kind of in your lap without having to have any of these state of nature arguments like Locke did state of nature. Rousseau and Hobbes are kind of more important for state of nature argument. These are all silly, in my opinion. You don't need them. And they didn't, I don't think, add much to the story. But so, yes, I think that there's a way to get behind that term. And I think that we should get behind that term and talk about the actual nuts and bolts of what we care about, because the term is completely poisoned, really. It means dozens of things at the same time to different people, and sometimes more than one to the same person. It's a very confusing term. It's been used as a derogatory slur for so long now by members of the conservative side of things that it's impossible to kind of undo the pejorative nature of it in any reasonable sense. So just for me, at least for the time being, it makes sense to get behind the term and stop using the toxic terminology.
Yeah, it's tricky, isn't it? Because as you've been doing this for quite a while, trying to educate people and raise their awareness about Marxism, but any sort of confusing terms that are thrown into the mix tends to throw people off the scent, which we certainly don't want. And I really like the American system, from what I know of it and my limited knowledge about the American Constitution and the amendments and the rights and so on. And you have a great history of patriotism in your country, you know, going back to the establishment of the country and fighting the British and all that stuff, of course. So I actually think on the bigger picture level, not to knock us off track, but I think on a bigger picture level, I think America is a very important battleground against Marxism for sure. And you know, say I actually did a little ranty video yesterday about just whatever popped into my head. It was about the concept of free speech, which kind of ties into classical liberalism, of course. And we know that because, well, you know as well as anybody that the history of Marxism across the world, or whatever label we put on it, can be very subversive, sneaky. It knows how to influence people using propaganda, conspiracy, and so on. And recently in Ireland, I noticed that, you know, some of the people on the political right are kind of accommodating and even platforming people who are pushing some form of Marxism or whatever. And then it brought up the concept of, or the debate about free speech and so on. And we know the Marxists love to cry free speech when they're not in control, but when they're in control, then they get rid of everyone else's free speech. So what's your thoughts on this? And I'm sure you've noticed there's a tremendous amount of naivete involved here.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a couple of things I think that are really important to talk about with the free speech debate. And one of those is that people don't really seem to know what free speech is or what it means or why it's important or valuable. I mean, I just outlined why it is. It's that if none of us actually has any special authority over the others and therefore has no authority to order other people's lives and their own approach to understanding truth, then we have to be able to let the less powerful person speak, not just hand the megaphone to the more powerful who will have it anyway, because you never know. They might be telling you something true that you've missed, that you overlooked. And of course, the Marxists have exploited that logic tremendously. But just to kind of finish the thought, there's a lot of things people, when we have these free speech debates online, especially now today, there's a lot of things people call, they invoke free speech that has nothing to do with free speech. For example, if somebody is insulting you on social media and you block them and then they say you don't value free speech, nobody is required by the principle of free speech to listen to people curse at them or insult them. In fact, part of free speech is being able to choose what you will say, but it's also choosing what you will and will not hear, right? It's also choosing what you will not say. Right. So it's not just that you can speak or that you can print or that you can engage in the press or that you can believe as you will in religion, as we have in our First Amendment, but the provision in the American Fifth Amendment that prevents you from incriminating yourself before a court is, in other words, that you're allowed to keep your silence is also part of free speech. So it's the freedom to say what you will and to not say what you wouldn't. So you can't have compulsion in speech. Marxists love compelled speech because they believe ultimately in a socialization hypothesis. They believe that human nature is ultimately that we're socialist or whatever, but they believe that everything in the entire society has brainwashed us not to understand who we really are. And so what they're going to do is seize control of the means of production such that everything in society is now arranged to brainwash us back into socialists as they see it. That's actually the theory. We are intrinsically socialists who've been alienated from our being by a productive system, slavery, feudalism, capitalism, advanced capitalism, whatever it happens to be. So we've been indoctrinated and socialized into believing in a system that's not real. So we're misled about who we are, and that we can return to who we are if we can be brainwashed back into being socialists. So they believe in compelling speech, compelling what you will hear, compelling what you won't hear, compelling what you can say, and compelling what you won't say, so that they can socialize you into being one of them, to socialize you into being a communist at the end of the day. And so free speech is a complete rejection of that, but free speech also is this broader idea. It does not mean that you can't block people you don't want to hear. It does not mean that you can say whatever you want. Also, this is another common mistake. It also does not mean that you should be guaranteed a platform. Just because you have free speech does not mean that you should be guaranteed to go on some large podcast. And if some large podcast does not want to invite you, they have not violated your free speech. They are engaging in something called free association. They are free to put you on the show or not, and you are free to go if invited or not. So this is a major mistake that people make about free speech, which you, like I started to say, you also can't just say anything you want. Why? Because the ultimate principle is actually that nobody has the authority to violate other people's rights. Therefore, you cannot engage in defamation. Apparently, a lot of people on the internet have forgotten this because of the difficulty in prosecuting defamation. But you can't defame people. You can't threaten people. You can't provide imminent threat. You cannot. You can yell fire in a crowded theater, at least in the United States you can, but there are a lot of things you can't actually say. You can lie, but you can't defame, for example. You cannot misrepresent a product that you are selling such that it might cause harm to the consumer. There are certain aspects of speech that are not actually protected. Threats kind of being key among them, and defamation being key among them. So it doesn't mean you get to say whatever you want with no consequences, whether those are legal consequences, as I just described. But people saying that they don't like what you said and saying what you said sucks also does not violate your free speech. It just enables theirs. So there's a lot of confusion about what free speech is. So free speech is used. It is a shibboleth of our culture, but it's used in this weird symbolic way that kind of seems to mean that people get to say whatever they want and nothing should ever happen to them. And there's a lot of misunderstanding, but at the same time, like you said, there's a lot of naivety, because the Marxists are, like you said, they cry free speech right up until the moment that they have power, and then their socialization program comes into play. And they weaponize social consequence up until the point when they can weaponize legal consequence. And that was where we ran into cancel culture, which is kind of a decentralized purge culture where they took advantage of certain legal and public relations issues for employers and so on to punish people for speech that they had engaged in the past or were engaging in the present. But that kind of brings up that second thing that's really important to say here with regard to free speech and Marxism, which is that we're ultimately dealing with the paradox of tolerance in free societies, right? So what we have at the bottom of the bottom of this discussion is, aside from people just not knowing what free speech means, but at the bottom of this discussion, what we have is, okay, we want a society where people can bring different hypotheses to bear, argue them out, so on. That's free speech. We can observe reality for ourselves, as I put it earlier. Then we can discuss, compare notes, whatever it is, fight it out verbally, not physically, to try to find out what's true. We want the so-called marketplace of ideas, but we also want the laboratory of ideas. We want it to be where people are bringing evidence, people are bringing reason and logic to bear. We also have what that has, though, and it's not exactly naivety unless we forget about it. That has the assumption that the speech is good faith, and not all speech is good faith, and it's difficult to detect bad faith speech. Okay, so should we have can we pass a law that says you can't engage in bad faith speech? Well, I mean, sort of, in very limited fashion. Like I said, you can't deliberately mislead a consumer about a product that you're selling. You can't do defamation, but it's very limited in what kinds of falsehoods you're not allowed to say. So you can definitely engage in a lot of bad faith activity, and the Marxists are exploiting that. They are more than happy to. So the question before us is, how do we deal with that? And the answer is by no means clear. The rubber meets the road in every free society. Even though it was like one paragraph footnote in Karl Popper's book in 45, it was called The Open Society and Its Enemies, trying to figure out what in the world this communist, fascist, especially the fascist problem and Nazi problem represented and how we got there. He has this one paragraph footnote called the paradox of tolerance, which is that if we tolerate the intolerant, we will become intolerant. But if we don't tolerate the intolerant, then we are intolerant. So tolerance seems to exist in paradox. The entire rubber meeting the road of a free society is the paradox of tolerance. It's this footnote, but it's one of the most important ideas that we have to start to grapple with. And the question becomes, when do you get to throw down your foot and say, I won't tolerate that speech? And obviously, like I said, there are limits that the law tends to bring in, which are defamation, threats, and so on. But then there's which are called unprotected speech or non-protected speech. But then there's this kind of like more sociocultural aspect. When do you get to kind of be intolerant as a response to intolerance is ultimately the question. And I have a principle that I hold to for that, which I call the principle of reciprocal tolerance, which is when you discover that a movement or even an individual, but particularly a movement, which has the capacity to do something about this, is it's speaking into something like free speech. It's speaking in the language of rights, but would not extend those rights. So it demands those rights for itself in order to advance. But if it were empowered, it would revoke those rights from the people who granted them the right in the first place. So they will not reciprocate the tolerance that they're taking advantage of. My opinion is that's a principle that leads us toward a solution to the paradox of tolerance, which is that free societies are under absolutely no obligation to tolerate ideologies that would basically stamp them out. If you come in and say that you want to have free speech and freedom of religion, et cetera, in order to install Sharia, frankly, just tough shit. You don't get to do that. We get to be intolerant to that. We don't have to be racist against Arabs or whatever else, or North Africans to do this, but we can be intolerant of those ideas, and we don't have to give them special provenance in our public discussion. We don't have to make special room for them. We don't have to accommodate them in our public spaces or discourse. And the same thing, and I used obviously there the example of Islam, but communism will revoke your freedom of speech immediately. So we have no obligation to tolerate the subversive speech of Marxists. When they scream free speech, we don't have to take them seriously because we know that they don't value that principle. We don't have to extend that to fascists. We don't have to extend it to religious theocrats, who we know also would rob us of whether it's Islam with Sharia or whether it's some sect of Christianity that's decided it wants to run a Christian theocracy. So we don't have to tolerate that. Now, that's not a legal designation. I'm not saying that the law should step in and necessarily prohibit that speech. But what I'm saying is that the law certainly shouldn't defer to that speech, and individuals are under no obligation to be tolerant of that which would not extend tolerance and reciprocation. That's my principle. Again, it's still rubber meets the road. How do you put that into practice? Hard question. Hard question.
Absolutely, yeah. It's very, very difficult, and particularly when people have been conditioned into, when they start to worship a concept like free speech, and then they leave their consciousness at the door and they stop thinking. I think that's never a good idea. You have to be willing to reevaluate stuff. And tell me as well, James, is it true that a great American patriot friend of mine, George, who's definitely going to watch this episode, he told me, we were talking about this subject, and I was telling him what I was dealing with on the Irish scene about the Marxists trying to manipulate this concept of free speech. And he said, I think it was Thomas Jefferson said something about the American Constitution being something that it's definitely a good guiding principle, but we should also be willing to be flexible with things and put the kind of well-being of the nation before the Constitution. Was he kind of right about that? And does that kind of relate to what we're talking about?
I don't know. I don't know the quote, so I don't know the context behind which Jefferson said that. The problem is that what is a constitution? First of all, it is the kind of legal bedrock of a country. It is actually the legal organization that is designed to literally constitute a country. That's why it's called a constitution. And so when you are willing to play fast or loose with that constitution, once it's written and ratified, you have a problem, which is now that you once you play fast and loose with it, you have no kind of solid principle upon which you can decide when you get to violate the Constitution and when you don't get to violate the Constitution. And so I would hedge, if Jefferson said that, and we'll assume the context is as it appears, I would hedge away from endorsing that view. Jefferson had other views that are hard to endorse, and thank God for James Madison, and also the French, which you never hear anybody say thank God for the French unless they're talking about wine or cheese. But in this case, Jefferson was in Paris while the Constitution was being written, so the French allowed him to be there, and he seemed to like it, so whatever they were doing, he liked. And he was writing letters back to Madison about what he thought should be in the Constitution. And James Madison, in his prudence, filtered a lot of Thomas Jefferson. He had some pretty wacky ideas about debt, as even when he became president. He sold our Navy, and then all of a sudden we had this huge problem. And we had to fight the Barbary pirates, and then we had to build a new Navy from scratch, which is expensive and so much for his plan about debt. They say that, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face or whatever. Well, everybody has a plan to pay off the national debt until the Barbary pirates show up and you have to build a Navy from scratch because you already sold it to pay off some other thing. And then you're in massive national debt. So anyway, I don't hold, this is another principle, by the way, within what we call classical liberal tradition, is that we don't look at our forefathers in thought, our original thought leaders, be they Jefferson, be they Madison, be they Washington in the American context, Locke, Reed, James Wilson, who is kind of a bridge from Reed into the American Constitution. He was part of the framing of the Constitution and the Declaration. He's a signer of the Declaration. Well, it doesn't matter who these people are. And we could go through, Marquis de Lafayette, Montesquieu, and so on. It doesn't really matter who these people are. Sometimes they were right, sometimes they were wrong, and we don't have to pretend that there's some kind of that they built some systematic, comprehensive, infallible philosophy that we have to follow like it's a theology. So I disagree with that idea that we should violate the Constitution. Now, this is a very interesting topic right now. And the reason that it's a very interesting topic is because it gets to the heart of what the more radical right is very interested in, which is this idea of legal normativism versus legal decisionism, which is it's a whole thing. But the idea of legal normativism is that you have something like the Constitution, then you have legal norms and laws that everybody has to follow based on that Constitution. So you have this political order that operates kind of like a machine. And then sometimes stuff happens that the machine is not particularly suited to deal with. You might say that it's technological in some cases. The founding fathers, when they wrote the Constitution, it's easy to say they couldn't have envisioned the internet, but it's also simpler to say that they didn't know what a cult was. So while they provided religious freedom, they said nothing about whether or not a lunatic cult can run the government or something like that. Could you make a law preventing the establishment of Jim Jones, right? So they had no vehicle to understand a concept like a cult or a militant ideology as we understand them today, though they were dealing obviously with Islam and the Barbary pirates and so on, and understood that there was a problem there because they were told directly that the reason that they were taking Americans as slaves was because the Quran permits it. And that's what they believed. So that's why we went and smashed them and said, well, we'll just deal with that. So anyway, the point is, legal normativism has this idea that once you have the Constitution, you have the legal system, it's like a machine. And sometimes there are these shocks to the machine that it doesn't know how to handle. So you need somebody in power who can make a decision. And Carl Schmitt, who went on to become a Nazi after this, the opening lines of Political Theology writes, "Sovereign is he who decides the exception." One of the more famous sentences in this line of political thought. So the sovereign should be able, the chief executive perhaps, should be able to decide the exception. And that's meant two ways. When are we in a state of exception and what do we do about it? And so there's this idea that sometimes, that's what Jefferson's sort of expressing here, sometimes if you look at the good of the nation and you look at the Constitution, you have to say, well, I'll step outside of the Constitution in order to preserve the good of the nation. But like I said, this puts you into what we could actually call the Schmittian paradox, which is once somebody, as he calls this person, a dictator or the sovereign, is allowed to step outside of the constitutional order in order to restore it. This is what Schmitt calls a commissarial dictator. What is ever to stop him from deciding he wants to just stay in charge, which is called a sovereign dictator? So he could declare a state of exception. Let's say it's totally legitimate. Something happens. We have a state of exception. He says, I'm going to save the day. I'm going to do this, that, and the other thing outside of the legal order. It's not constitutional, but I'm going to do it. And it does save the nation. And then they say, very good, sovereign. Everybody cheers. There's parades. Everybody's happy. Now it's time to go back to being bound by the Constitution, because the name for this character is the unbound executive in Schmitt's writing. It's time to be bound again. And then the what is to stop this person, the sovereign, at that point from saying that's an emergency and I will not, and I will kill you for suggesting it, to solve that exception? There's no answer to this. This is like the Schmittian paradox. If you believe that there should be executive decisionist policy or opportunity, then you have absolutely no block from a bad actor in that position running amok with it. And so I think that people, including Madison, for example, writing the Constitution, if you read in, for example, Federalist 51, he's very clear with Alexander Hamilton on this particular point. So if you look at this, you can see that our founders were of the mind that that's just, we get it, but that's not going to work. So maybe even Jefferson, like I said, I don't know the context, but maybe Jefferson was suggesting this and Madison overrode him on this, which happened in other places for sure. But they were cognizant that the Schmittian paradox, almost a century and a half before it arose from Carl Schmitt, because there's no solution to that problem. They said, look, no, the president will always actually be bound by the Constitution. The Constitution will be the highest law of the land. And I think that this is correct, because if you can step outside of the Constitution and the Constitution is what defines the nation, then you are actually redefining the nation in the process of doing that. And you could say, well, what about what Abraham Lincoln did? Well, that was actually Carl Schmitt's example of a commissarial dictator, and there's lots of points to debate about that, and lots of Southerners where I live are still very sore about that. Other people are as well, and I've read some on that. And right or wrong, it's kind of what happened, but we are where we are. But I generally veer toward that the Constitution has to be upheld. It has to be what it has to be enacted as what it says. If the Constitution sucks, maybe you have to come up with a new Constitution, but whatever the Constitution you come up with is, that's what you've got to work with. So if Jefferson says it and it seems to mean what it sounds like it means, I don't agree with Thomas Jefferson there, and I would defer to this more Madisonian thinking on that particular point.
Interesting stuff. Great stuff, James. Thanks. And I actually just thought when it comes to, say, you come out with a great phrase recently talking about, okay, so when I'm explaining this subject overall to, say, the rookies or people who are refusing to see how influential Marxism is across the world, including the Western world, I kind of join the different causes. So I look at, say, the Palestinian, actually the lefties show us what their agenda is by the stuff they get involved in. So it could be, trans rights or the Palestinian rights or radical feminism, climate change movement. And a lot of it, what kind of woke me up is that it was based on the class struggle concept of oppressor and oppressed, or somebody or some things being oppressed. And you came out with a great phrase recently to sum it up that a few people have kind of said it back to me, that you said that the issue is never the issue is always the revolution. Could you kind of expand on that for us, and what did you mean by that?
Yeah, so first, let me not take credit for something that's not mine. I had heard that phrase and knew that it came from somewhere, but didn't know where it came from, and found out later. But it comes from David Horowitz, who recently died. David Horowitz grew up radical. He wrote a very interesting book called Radical Son, and then he dipped out of being a left-wing radical. So he, if I remember correctly, and I know I'm on camera, but don't quote me specifically on this, double check me on this. I think he was actually involved with Students for a Democratic Society, with SDS. But he said that he picked up the motto from them, from the leftists. It wasn't just a mentality he was describing, but a motto that they understood intentionally on their own. And what it means is that the particular cause or issue that's in front of them is instrumental. It's not the thing they actually care about. If they're fighting for trans, they don't actually care about trans. They care about changing the political system, and they're using trans as, say, a hammer to do it, or a screwdriver, or whatever other tool. So every single issue they take up is an instrumental point. With feminism, it's not. The feminists certainly cared about women, and the trans activists, many of them do care about trans and trans issues. But the organizers on some level, and especially it's interesting because also the useful idiots, the foot soldiers, as some people end up calling them, the ideological zealots who get woke, don't care. I mean, they're emotionally invested, but they don't actually care that much about any given issue, which is why they can change issues so quickly. Like this week, they're all worked up about trans, and next week they're all worked up about Palestine, and the next week they're all worked up about Mexican independence or something. And so it just can switch. And I actually see this logic written. This isn't like that it evolved by the 1960s culture, 70s culture that David Horowitz was ensconced in, and he observed it. This is at the beginning, at least with Marxism. It's on the last page of the Communist Manifesto. I don't have it in front of me to quote it exactly, but the sentence is very much, it's right at the end. It's not the very, very end. Oh, yeah, you have it. So maybe I have to put my glasses on here. It's at the very, very end here. It says, communists, where is it? Do you have in short, the communists everywhere support every revolutionary movement against the existing social and political order of things. And so they believe there's a system that produces a status quo, and anything that can break the system, they say right there on the page, they support it. They are part of it. So the issue for them is not the issue. But then look at what it says below that, the next sentence. In all these movements, they bring to the front as the leading question in each the property question, no matter what its degree of development at the time. What does that mean? That means if they dive into the trans issue, they dive into the trans issue because of its destructive potential and to turn it to the communist purpose. In other words, is exactly what I just said. It is an instrumental use of a particular issue at a particular time in a particular place because of its mobility and utility for damaging the existing system. So it is a model of overthrow. It is a model of tearing something down and seizing control of it. There's another saying, I've said it a lot in the past, I haven't said it in a long time, is that communists are great at conquest and bad at management. So they're really good at doing this and using whatever the issue is that's in front of them that's productive to take power that they then can't use correctly. I used to phrase it as communists don't know how. They don't know how anything works, but they know how to take it over. They know how to get control of an institution. They just can't do anything with it except use it to do the only thing that they do, which is raise consciousness, which is to say make more communists, and try to damage society further. And it doesn't matter what the existing society is. That's their target. So that's what that phrase means. And I'm not the progenitor of that phrase, as I made clear. I am a popularizer of that phrase. I didn't start attributing it as I should have until I learned where it actually came from, which was sometime after I heard the phrase, which sometimes happens with things that are floating around out there and you run with them.
Yeah, David Horowitz, what a great guy, and I love people who are honest, who have the guts to admit that they were brainwashed and were going down the wrong path, and then turn themselves around and are actually speaking out against what they stood for before. So I think it's very, very noble. There's a few people in Ireland I know like that as well, and that sentence at the end of the Communist Manifesto is certainly very, very central. And interestingly, it just made me think of how the Marxists always have something going on, and it reminds me of Saul Alinsky, who Horowitz talked about. He said he had a conversation with him once, and Alinsky was pretty much saying, "Why are you so open? You should be a little bit more sneaky." But one of the things that Alinsky said in Rules for Radicals, I think, was something to do with, in my book, I kind of compared to what he was talking about to he was talking about how it was very important for them to always have a new cause happening. So while one is finishing, they're starting another one. And I kind of liken it to like a kind of like a communist shark that needs to keep going, or whatever, needs to keep going so it kind of breathe. And the thing as well, I just thought of is the whole that you talked about oppressor and oppressed, class struggle and class consciousness. I mean, how do you explain this one to, say, the complete rookies, and how important is this concept?
I mean, it's central to the concept. If we don't have to go back to the beginning of the Communist Manifesto, but it's literally the first sentence of the first chapter is that all of history, he says, is the history of class struggle, which therefore means it's the central idea. Literally, their model of how human society works is that it's class struggle. So it's completely central. The thing is like you said, with the issue and the cause, not only are there individual causes within the broader, say, property question or race question or whichever, you can jump from property question to race question to sexual question to whatever. You can jump subjects. So you can have another cause. You can actually have another domain filled with causes. And what that does, it's not just even like a shark, which is a brilliant metaphor, actually, has to keep moving forward and constantly consuming, but it's also it psychologically or neurobiologically, probably it keeps a dopamine up. It's very easy to get fatigued fighting for something. It's exciting, it's new, there's all this new terminology, things are happening, you have a new group of people to care about, all this is very exciting. And then you get 2 or 3 years in, or even a year and a half in, and it's a slog. It turns into a slog. It's not as fun anymore. And so if you can switch causes, all of a sudden you get the dopamine rush back up. You get your radicals motivated again. Plus you keep them in a state of agitation and irritation. Oh my God, we fought 5 battles already, and now there's a 6th one. The world is going to hell. You can keep them in that state of agitation. So I think it's psychologically very important. But class struggle is the communist phrase for something that's also known as the friend-enemy distinction. This is actually the logic, oppressor versus oppressed. Like I said, if we did look at the first page of the Communist Manifesto, of chapter 1, I should say, you see it right there. He says, class struggle is all of history, blah, blah, blah. In a word, oppressor versus oppressed. And Marx himself frames it as oppressor versus oppressed. And so what that means is that you have 2 classes, the oppressor class and the oppressed class. He shows several examples of how that class can change during different conditions of history, different periods in history. And so you have this intrinsic idea of 2 classes in conflict with one another. And so you have the oppressor class is identified as the enemy of a unified oppressed class. So this is the logic that later gets called the friend-enemy distinction. You have the enemy, which is clearly identified. The class enemy that is causing the class struggle is identified. And for Marx, it was the capitalists together with the bourgeoisie, which were usually just called the bourgeoisie or the capitalist class. And then you have all of the workers, eventually all of the peasants. It wasn't originally to include peasants, but it eventually includes peasants, all the workers, all of the peasants, and basically everybody who feels screwed by this system or isn't getting as far ahead as they think they should be able to. And those people have one job. And their job, 2 jobs actually. One is to wake up to what's going on, to raise the class consciousness or the feminist consciousness or the race consciousness. Raise consciousness is the first job. And the second job is to fight the enemy. Okay, so it's their job, that the thing that you're uniting in, it doesn't matter what the cause is, to tear down is the system that's run by the oppressor class. So that's the enemy. And their one job, other than to wake people up to join the fight, is to fight the enemy. So this is why they can have all this multitude of causes. This is why you can have this conglomeration of things that don't make sense, like Queers for Palestine, where if you actually were in Palestine and you were queer, they would kill you. But you can have this alliance because what they're doing is they're splitting the world into friends and enemies. They've named the enemy. The enemy is the oppressor class, the broad capitalist class, the white, the whatever, but it's the oppressors. And then everybody else are going to be the friends. And friends are those who fight the enemy. So you name the enemy, and then certain people fight the enemy, and everybody who fights the enemy are allies in solidarity who fight the enemy, and they are the friends of the friend-enemy distinction. That's what this refers to. So you have this structure that I want to just kind of highlight, that you have an ideological movement which probably has leadership. The Communist Party would have been its leadership in the communist case. that declares an enemy, and then everybody who comes together to fight that enemy is the friend. And an important side dynamic here is that anybody who refuses to fight the enemy is the enemy. They're complicit in keeping the enemy going. So if you don't join the fight, if you don't declare yourself friend to the communists, you become enemy to the communists, and you're under attack as well. Same for fascists, same for Islamists, same for any totalitarian ideology. And so this is the dynamic of class struggle, is this friend-enemy distinction. Now, of course, that's interesting because when I keep using this phrase, the friend-enemy distinction was given its name by the one and only same Carl Schmitt that I just talked about a few moments ago, writing in 1932 in Germany, the year before he became a Nazi, and used the friend-enemy distinction and his political theology theory that I talked about before in order to justify Hitler's dictatorship and its operation. So the fascist party or the Nazi party in that case could declare the enemy, as they did, for example, on the Night of Long Knives. So the left-leaning faction that were kind of concentrated in the Sturmabteilung in the SA were going to be now the enemy of the more right-leaning faction of the Nazis that was Hitler's faction. So he just has them all killed one night in the Night of Long Knives. And consolidates his power. This is the same mentality as the purge mentality of the Soviet Union or of Mao Zedong's communism, etc. But this is just the friend-enemy distinction. The sovereign or the party in action has the capacity as the entity in power over that group of people to declare the enemy, and then everybody is going to fight the enemy, and anybody who doesn't want to fight the enemy the right way is also part of the enemy and is to be destroyed by everybody who is fighting the enemy. And so this logic permeates the class struggle. The class struggle is this logic. It doesn't matter that the Nazis call it the friend-enemy distinction. It's the exact same logic. And this logic is, in fact, the birthplace of the identity politics. It's the birthplace of the, like you said, these solidarity causes that seem not to make any sense. Like after the attack on October 7th in Israel in 2023. So we know the date of that. I went to London the end of October, that same month, 3 weeks later, and they had these huge marches. A lot of people, I'm sure, remember they happened everywhere around Europe, especially, but beyond Europe, they had these huge marches, 150,000 strong, they said, in London the day the Saturday I was there. They did them every Saturday, marching through the city in support of Palestine. And then when you look around, you have all these placards, all these signs, all these flags and things that are being given out at these booths. And all the booths are the Socialist Workers' Party of the UK. And it's like, okay, so why are the socialists now teamed up with these people? Like, what's going on? Why is it the socialists that are operating in direct solidarity with the Muslim pro-Palestine people? Like, what the hell is going on here? But what's going on here is the logic of everything we just said. This explains the Red-Green Alliance, for example, first aligned in the Communist Manifesto, and then second, that they are friends of convenience against a common enemy that's been declared, which is our free Western societies. And they'll figure out their own enmity later. And anybody who goes against that is also the enemy. Therefore, the logic is very dangerous, very totalitarian. It's organized around purges, cancel culture, struggle sessions, and so on. And the whole logic of woke falls out. So how central is class struggle? Yes, it is central. It is the central piece. It is the object around which pretty much the entire thing works, unless you kind of get deeper down into the philosophical why. But in terms of the practical how, it is literally the central object of what we're dealing with when we deal with any totalitarian ideology. Marxism for certain, there explicitly. Fascism for certain, it's written explicitly. In fact, its logic was developed by people who were using this thought in very clear language, and Islamism as well, which takes the Muslim Brotherhood's philosophy of Islamism is outlined by Sayyid Qutb in Milestones, makes it very clear. But he, of course, was a Leninist before he was an Islamist, so he's just importing Lenin's friend-enemy distinction or class struggle model for radical Islam. So it's no surprise that it's the same exact engine. Whether that applies to all of Islam or not is probably, I don't think most Muslims actually subscribe to the very radical way of thinking. They call it al-bara, which means loyalty and disavowal, but it's the exact same logic. So there will be loyalty to all other Muslims and disavowal of all kafir, of all infidels. So That logic is the central object, practically speaking. There are philosophical points, and that's where fascism, Nazism, socialism, and Islamism actually diverge.
Yeah, that class struggle concept was it kind of switched me onto things around 2018 by accident, because I realized that a lot of the stuff I was already talking about when I started this podcast as a complete beginner was they all just tended to be causes tied in with Marxist revolution. And once a person even has a basic understanding, or they've read the Communist Manifesto, once they get that concept in there of a class struggle, you start to see it everywhere with all these causes. And as you pointed out, you get these weird alliances like Queers for Palestine, these contradictory alliances, or the connection between Islam and Marxism itself seems like a bit strange bedfellows as well. And you look at the class struggle concept, it indeed does seem to be central. And as well as that, you actually have described this as being like a religion, or kind of a cult. And some people would kind of find that a bit odd, because, say, Marxism traditionally, or communism, seems to have been put itself forward as like an atheistic movement. And they believe, some of them believe in this utopian idea of a classless society, no money, no private property, no God, and so on. So how does it kind of work, or how did you reach the attitude that they're a type of a cult?
Well, what the communists are, or what Marx is actually answering, he doesn't do this in capital, obviously, which is 1867 publication date. He does this and it's not in the Communist Manifesto, which he wrote with Engels. It's written in his works that were written earlier in the early 1840s. His very kind of religious works, his economic philosophic manuscript from 1844, his critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, which he actually never finished, that he wrote in 43 going into 44, right at the cusp of the year. Those writings, he's much more kind of clear about his relationship to religion and what he actually thinks, but also he very much reveals his hand. Now, there's a caveat to point out here before we get into it, which is that this writing was not published at all until much later, well into the 20th century. So your typical Marxist in, say, 1880 would not have been familiar with this unless, for whatever reason, Marx had shown him his private writing, or whatever small group of people had actually seen it. But in these documents, he reveals that this is the thinking behind the entire program that he has, and that thinking is that it's very clear that what he's actually grappling with, in addition to the economic circumstances as Europe transitions out of feudalism and into capitalism, and he's trying to make sense of this transition in some sense economically, but with kind of very piss poor economic theory. He's simultaneously grappling with the question, what does it mean to be human? And it's very, very clear that the philosophic part of the economic philosophic manuscript is the question of what it means to be human. And it's very clear in his critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, for example, from the first page, that he believes that religion has obscured from people what it means to be human. It's clear in his 1843 essay on the Jewish question that religion has obscured from people what it means to be human. So he spends a lot of time in the economic philosophic manuscripts explaining that what it means to be human is to be what he calls a species being, which is ultimately a socialist. It is a human being who lives for the entire species, an individual that lives for the species. And he talks about this in literally transformative language, that when you realize that man's true human nature is his social nature, which can also be translated as socialist nature, when you realize that this is the question he's answering, and he starts to develop it, he goes full religion with it. He's calling it the positive transcendence of private property, as human self-estrangement, and thus a complete return of man to himself as a human being, which is to say, as a social being. He says that. And then he goes on.
Socialist Man, yeah.
That's right, socialist man. So he has this other concept of who we really are. And he starts talking about how when you awaken to this, it transforms your eye, and it transforms your ear, and it transforms all your senses, like an acquired taste. Like a man who doesn't know how to appreciate wine comes to appreciate wine and thinks it went from tasting bad to good. You develop this different sense of the entire world around you, a different perceptual sense of the entire world around you, when you realize that man is by man for man, that we are the product of our own creation. As a matter of fact, that's his origin myth for man, is that man created himself. We are the product of our own creation. We create ourselves through doing things in the world and seeing ourselves in what we created and realizing, therefore, that we are creative, that our imaginative capacity can, which is subjective, can become objective by interacting with the real world. And he calls it humanizing the real world, to make a stick into a spear, or a tree into a picnic table, or whatever example you want to use, or a home. We're making the world fit for human use according to human imagination. So we're transforming the world. And that's how we learn who we are as humans. That's what separates us from the mere animals and the beasts, is that we have this capacity. And so that what we need to also understand is that we don't do this for ourselves. We do this for all of each other at the same time. And then we can learn to transcend private property and liberate ourselves by returning to our true social nature. So when you're asking the question, the fundamental question, what does it mean to be human, and how is that produced, and how do we interact with one another? You're asking fundamentally religious questions, and you're providing answers, which he does. He doesn't ask the question and leave it hanging. He provides answers. We are intrinsically socialist. We've been alienated by the enemy class from our true nature. And so what we need to do is to supersede ourselves by retracting that sense of alienation into ourselves, and awakening of the class consciousness, which is to say, as a collectiveness, a collectivity or a collective consciousness organized by class, in order to engage in class conflict or class struggle, which is to say the friend-enemy distinction. When he gives these answers, he is outlining a ersatz religion, or a quasi-religious structure. He's answering the kinds of questions that religion answers. You say, James, how do you know that? Well, here in the U.S., we have to deal with religion in a very practical way, because we have this thing in our Constitution, our First Amendment, the Bill of Rights, called the Establishment Clause, that Congress shall make no law regarding the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So that's the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment right there. Okay, so that means things go to court. Cults go to court, churches go to court, other things go to court. People decide, that they're secular humanists and they don't want to go to war, and they want to be conscientious objectors and all kinds of things, and they go to court. So the court, which is a secular institution, has to weigh in on when something counts as a religion and when it doesn't, in order to meet the baseline, the parameters to which the Establishment Clause applies. So they can make no law regarding the establishment of a religion. Okay, so they have an answer to this, that it is a comprehensive system of belief and practice that answers fundamental questions about what it means to be human, and what it means to be alive, or to live, and such that it gives rise to duties of conscience. Those are the three characteristics. It has to be a comprehensive system of belief and practice. The Marxists check that box. It has to answer fundamental questions about what it means to be human. Well, we're socialists, and we have to return to that, so it has duties of conscience. So we have all of the pieces necessary for, even from a position of, well, there's no God and all this. So when you look at his atheism stuff, what Marx is actually doing, and it's quite clear if you actually read these early writings of Marx, where he talks a lot about religion, is he's plowing the field. Your religion is something that allows you to, he calls it the opium of the masses in his critique of Hegel's philosophy of right. And the reason he does that is because it's preventing you, he says, from seeing your real conditions. Life sucks, and you're like, well, God's teaching me a lesson, and we'll pray through it, and all of this. So it's like an opiate. It numbs you. You're still in pain, but you're numb to it. The way an opiate works is that you are in pain, but you don't care you're in pain. It doesn't actually kill the signal. It's not actually an analgesic. It is, in fact, it makes you, in a sense, like numb to the fact you don't care that you hurt. And so this is his vision for what religion is doing to people, for the suffering and the real conditions. And he says that if you get religion out of the way, then man will be forced to reckon with his real conditions as they are. Then the idea is that when he's facing those real conditions, he's going to first throw off religion, and then he is going to start to critique his society, which he'll start to realize that he's socialist man on down the track. And that's the program. So the atheism is getting other religions out of the way. You can't be a Christian or a Jew. You have to get that out of the way. Then you can take up learning to be communist. And if you say, James, that's not very convincing, I turn you back to the economic philosophic manuscripts, where he's dead explicit about this fact, where he goes after atheism. He spends pages going after atheism, saying that atheism is incomplete. It's just a beginning. It's not what you're actually going for. So what you have then is you have this ersatz religious belief structure. Why is it a cult? Well, it's a cult because it operates off of the friend-enemy distinction. There are the people who believe it, and anybody who doesn't believe it is part of the enemy. They're complicit. They have false consciousness, can't understand the world. So therefore, there's the mechanisms of isolating people from the real world, seeing everybody outside as a potential threat or an enemy, seeing the outside world as something that brainwashes you away from that belief system, tries to make sure that you don't stay inside or fall inside of it. That's the hallmarks of a cult. And at his time in life, the Communist Party, as he says in the second chapter of the Communist Manifesto, as Lenin instantiated in the Vanguard model in What is to be Done in 1902, this model is that the Communist Party is going to be the cult leaders. They're going to tell you what you're supposed to believe. They're going to be what the Nazis called the party in action. So they're going to be the arbiters of what is the correct way to think and be and everything else. And you are to shun or report or destroy anything outside of that. This is classic cult isolation techniques. It's Robert Lifton in his book, Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, where he's analyzing Mao Zedong's circumstances in the 1950s in China, calls this milieu control. So in a cult environment, the milieu that every member finds themselves in is under total control all the time. He says that these things have a sacred science to which everybody must defer. That's the immortal science, as they call it, of Marxism. And you could just go down the track, as he's got 8 different characteristics of what defines a totalizing or cult environment. And this just ticks off all the boxes. It is not a old-fashioned intrinsic cult of personality where you have one charismatic leader necessarily. Obviously, the Communist Party, whether it's Lenin, whether it was Stalin, whether it was Mao in China, whether it's Pol Pot, whether it's any of the Kim family in North Korea, we could go down the list. They end up with these cults of personality around these kind of charismatic dictators. But that's not the model in communism. It doesn't start with the guy and then go out. It starts with the ideology and then consecrates a guy. And so what you have is this ideological cult mentality, but you don't necessarily have, the one weird dude in flowing robes who everybody has to give their wives over to and their children or something. So it's not like, when we think of cults, I think this is actually a separate point. We don't have to go down this rabbit hole, but when we think of cults, we think of some weird guy in robes on a compound somewhere with like 200 people or less, telling them all kinds of strange stuff. Or we think of things that are like really weird offshoots of a existing church that believe very strange things and then, try to recruit people. Maybe we think of Scientology or something like this, and that's a good segue. Cults are, unlike online, cults are a completely different phenomenon. An ideological cults are a completely different phenomenon. Right now, we live in an age of cults like I don't know that we've seen in maybe 200 years. The cults are, I don't know, that's the progressive era 100 years ago was pretty wild too. There were a lot of cults then. But we're in an age of cults. And the reason we're in an age of cults at the moment is because social media enables a new kind of cult leader. We call this person an influencer. Not all influencers are cult leaders, but all online cult leaders are influencers. And so they're very, very effective at creating these kind of niche, self-referential communities that view all outside forces as threatening. And that's kind of the key dynamic here. The ideological cults work the same way. So I call it a cult because it has an ersatz religious structure that would satisfy the Supreme Court's definition of a religious object for purposes of Establishment Clause if the right case got brought before them and they saw it in the right light. It certainly, in my opinion, meets those 3 criteria. Not that the court has ever declared it a religion. It explicitly declared communism as not one in the 50s. I think that is a mistake, but that's its own debatable point. But it's an ersatz religious belief structure that tries to isolate its members from outside thinking through what amounts to a friend-enemy dynamic, and that makes it a cult. And so that's why I call it a cult. I'm not trying to be pejorative with labels that are very bad most of the time. I'm actually trying to be descriptive.
No, that's perfect because actually, well, I might as well mention it now actually because I was going to mention to you in private correspondence. I think it's interesting that I only became aware of you much to my shame a few years ago. But even back in 2018, I was already starting to look at it as being a cult movement because you look at the fanaticism, how they act towards the enemy. Exactly what you said. They identify as being a separate group from society. They're very hostile when you challenge their beliefs, and they're completely beyond reason. Like, it really is fascinating. And because something you mentioned there, kind of tying into the Socialist Man stuff as well. I mean, is this kind of where the concept of woke comes from somehow? That like we kind of use it as a derogatory term to kind of mock them or whatever, but maybe they use it as a pride term or whatever, that they're somehow enlightened or something. Like, it reminds me of the concept, and I think it was in the New Statesman magazine, created by the Fabian Society, images of like the lights in the minds of men, and there was some sort of higher level they could reach. Is that somehow connected with this at all?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's exactly what I think that they've done is they've woke up to what it really means to be human. Obviously, the term comes from black slang that you're supposed to be woke or hip or awake to or aware of racism that doesn't necessarily present itself in a very overt forms. That's where the slang term actually comes from. But the idea is that you have in the theoretical applications that it turned out to apply to, is that you've awoken to a critical consciousness, which is a extension of the class consciousness or feminist consciousness or sexual consciousness or whichever queer consciousness, you name it. You got all of them. Fat consciousness, I suppose. It's always fun to throw the fat studies ones in there. But at any rate, yeah, it's that they woke up and they think that they are now kind of more enlightened. They see the world. I mean, this is what the thesis basically of One-Dimensional Man is that Herbert Marcuse wrote in 1964, is that capitalism has flattened everybody out into this kind of like one-dimensional existence where you get up, you go to work. The point is to earn money so that you can buy the stuff that you saw in commercials so you can have a happy life. And so you have this very consumerist mindset. So you work in an industry that produces consumerist stuff so that you can purchase consumerist stuff from other producers so that you can pretend to be happy and live out and die. And he's like, yeah, it's a pretty good life actually, but it's not an ideal life. There's like a higher level thinking. And he says this second dimension of thought is the critical theory, is the critical thinking. And not critical thinking like that you're skeptical of assumptions, but rather the critical thinking that you believe that there's a power system, a class struggle that is intrinsic to society that's almost invisible to the majority of people in it that you understand. That's what you wake up to. That's the woke in waking up, or the awake in waking up, or woke, whatever. All the words are the same word. This is why when the fascists, or the Nazis, I should say, when they started to march across Germany, one of their slogans was Deutschland erwacht, which means Germany awake or Germany awaken. So the idea is that they woke up to what Hitler called the racial worldview, the racial Weltanschauung, of how reality really works. And so they think that they understand reality on a different level than everybody else. That it's, in fact, the formal idea that we call woke is called critical constructivism. And so this has this idea that, in fact, what they believe is that we don't know if the world is really out there. In fact, it might not be. Well, all we know is what we perceive. And so the perceptual actually precedes the objective and the real. So maybe there is no objective. Maybe there is no value neutral. Maybe there's no true equality or any of this. And so all we have is what we perceive. But their second thesis, that's the constructivist thesis, is that perception precedes reality. It doesn't come from reality. So in a sense, the world is in our head, in that when we think something's true, it's because we have consensus. Lots of people think it's what is out there at the same time, for whatever reason, usually socially mediated reasons. But then the critical part is those social processes themselves are actually defined by power dynamics, that there are people in power who are there under the terms of class struggle. Basically, they're there for bad, self-serving reasons. Most of them are ignorant to the fact that this is how the world works. Some of them are not, and they do it intentionally for their own benefit, but none of them are willing to challenge the system. So they are now awake to this idea that we all misperceive the world. Therefore, the world is not as it actually appears. It is not as it actually is. And they're trying to go around and wake people up to get people to believe that the world is different than it is. This is no different than Marx going around waking people up to socialist consciousness and class consciousness, which is that ultimately you're a socialist at heart who's been alienated from it. And there's a dynamic of class oppression that's causing this, and there's an ideology of capitalism that brainwashes you into believing it so that you can't see it for yourself. So they have this, belief that they know the secret sauce of society, this hidden dimension of reality, and that they're sort of like emissaries trying to teach us about the higher spiritual truths of what it means to be human. And not sure what that looks like, but there's no class division, there's no racism, there's no sexism, there's no transphobia, there's no homophobia, there's no inequality, there's no injustice. They have all these nice things. They don't know what those things look like. They just know that when there's a bad thing, that's not who we really are. And so that's part of our lower false existence, where we're fighting to try to make ends for ourselves rather than to make ends for everybody. So yeah, it's very cult-like in this regard.
Yeah, absolutely. The whole, that explains certainly a lot of that incredible hubris we see in them when you're interacting with them. And I've dealt with it so many times. You're looking at these people who've just come out of their, humanities course or whatever in university, or they're working with an NGO, or they've got a socialist friend, and they look at you with the big eyes like they have all the answers, and they know better than the rest of us. And it obviously makes them extremely dangerous. And you can see that a mixture of probably gullibility, or maybe a lack of intelligence, combined with the being indoctrinated with this idea of you are here to save us all, and then they just off they go then, and they're unstoppable almost. And the concept as well, a great concept you come out with a while ago, was the concept of like the woke right, which I know everyone is talking about now, and they're always asking you about it. How could you define this for someone? I know you weren't really you mentioned, I think before, you weren't really happy with it in some ways, but you're definitely onto something. So what does this concept mean?
Well, I mean, it kind of means the same thing, is that you think that the society's organized and rigged against you. The thing is that, and that you can awaken to the real reasons that people like you are alienated. People like you is ambiguously defined here. It's very clear in the class dynamic of the left how people like you are defined. You're members of the same class, or the enemy is the members of the other class, right? So it's very, very simple in the class struggle model of who people like you refers to. If it's racial minorities versus whites, if it's women versus men, if it's queer versus heteronormative or cis heteronormative or whatever, just normative in general, if it's workers versus their employers, it's very easy to kind of tell who the classes are. So who people like you count as. On the woke right, they define people like you differently. They do so nationalistically, as kind of a nation, as this grand extension of a family. So the collectivity involved is a particular people, and there's a lot of ways to define a people. Maybe they share the same language, maybe they live in the same place, maybe they have to have both of those characteristics, maybe they have the same cultural background, maybe the same language. Maybe I already said that one. Maybe they have the same historical circumstances that led to their being. Maybe they have the same common destiny, same religion, same race, same ethnicity. There's a lot of ways to define a nation. And if you look historically, whether it's Stalin, whether it's the Nazis, whatever, you see people grasping at the Mussolini for his Italian nationalism, grasping at what it means for that nation to be the nation. The simplest way to kind of put it is that the Stalin kind of had it as, it's like similar people with a similar historical condition who speak the same language, who live in roughly the same place. And then the Italians had it as people who were basically on that peninsula, kind of unified politically through a long history, somewhat, dipping into the Catholicism, but it was a very political definition. What defines a nation is a very kind of political grouping of similar smaller states that speak similar languages and are located in roughly the same place. When you get to the Nazis, Hitler was very explicit. A nation is racial. It's a folk. And it has racial characteristics, and it cannot be understood outside of that context. When you get to Spain with Franco, though he's not a fascist, in the full sense. Some people call him semi-fascist. Some people say he's merely a right-wing authoritarian. Other people say he's a fascist. I think semi-fascist is a good way to go with that. But his answer was largely cultural and religious. What made Spaniards is that they had a similar long historical culture. So there's a historical particularism, and that they were Catholic, which was a big surprise to a lot of Spaniards who were not Catholic. Many were Protestant, many were Muslim. The Iberian Peninsula is a complicated place historically. Same with Salazar in Portugal. So there's going to be this religious cultural element to defining the people. And so what you have, though, is a different collectivity, which is a nation, which is like an extended family bound by whatever characteristics made that people who they are. And like I said, there's a lot that's up for grabs there. There's a lot of contentious space. So it's much, much less clear who counts, except in the Nazis' case, who counts in the class and who does not count in the class. But the dynamic is still the class struggle. It's still a friend-enemy distinction. The underlying motivation is still systematic or systemic alienation by some societal force that they have awakened to that other people don't understand. This is why you hear the woke right always say you don't know what time it is. Well, what time is it is that the corrupting elements that threaten the authentic nation have gotten to such a severe state that the nation's going to collapse. That's what time it is. But that's the secret thing they understand. They have, their idea of a system of power that has contoured everything to keep people like them away from the levers of power in order to perpetuate their own corrupt regime so that the alienated stay alienated. In this case, the authentic right has been alienated. The authentic religion, whether it's authentic Catholicism pre-Vatican II, whether it's authentic hardcore positive muscular whatever Christianity in the Protestant regard, it's been thrown off the table primarily since World War II said we can't have another Hitler. Therefore, we have this whole global system of thought and power that has hegemony that prevents radical right-wing thought from rising up again because of the threat that it presents. And therefore, people like them are excluded. And then the rightful inheritors of the nation aren't getting their just due. So when you look at it that way, it's the same story relocated with some different parts, right? The class struggle is definitely a struggle between two classes on the left. But here, what you have is a battle of the authentic nation against forces of corruption and pollution. So it's more like instead of, I actually recorded a podcast about this the other day on my own platform, the New Discourses platform. But I said that the class struggle is like if you took a piece of paper and drew a horizontal line across the paper all the way and divided it into two halves. Above the line, you have oppressor. Below the line, you have oppressed. And then that's kind of the way the woke left class model works. And then the woke right nation model, it'd be like you took another piece of paper and you drew a bubble. You drew a circle. Inside the circle is the authentic nation, and it's under threat from all of these polluting and contaminating and corrupting forces that are outside of it. And the idea actually is that we've been too tolerant. We've allowed too much of that pollution and corruption to spread, and therefore the essential core of what made the nation successful in the first place has been lost or is under tremendous threat. Therefore, the people who are the rightful inheritors of that national system will not come into their inheritance, and they're alienated from who and what they should really be. This gets weird when you look at the actual fascists and the Nazis who believed that by uniting as they were going to do, that they were going to be able to march forward to progress humanity to its next stage through collective action. I don't know necessarily that all of the woke right believe that, but I've read enough of their books to know that some of them believe things like that. That you usually see it is that they're the protectors of some kind of poorly defined object called the common good that nobody else has the prudence and virtue to protect except for them. But there you have this same, like, they understand the world better than everybody else. They occupy a less polluted, less corrupt, therefore more moral position than everyone else. Therefore, they are intrinsically elite and therefore have a right to rule that should not be able to be contested. And when they come into their rule, they will be able to reorder us to a golden age that we've lost. So rather than returning to our true socialist nature, we're going to return to our authentic expression of who we are, and a golden age will emerge, just like a stateless, classless society in which there is plenty, and it will be from each according to his ability and to each according to his needs. So it's a similar model. There are certain parts that are different, certain parts that are opposite. It's not an identical model because it's class struggle versus national struggle. But it's still that the classes are a collectivity that operates in, friend enemy distinction, collective sense, and the nation is a collectivity that operates in the friend enemy collective sense. So many of the pieces are still the same, and the awakened mindset that they alone know what's really going on in society is the same. And what unites them is that they're both idealist. The socialists, the communists have this ideal vision of who humanity is. There is the ideal man who is Socialist Man, and we're going to return to him. And when everybody is Socialist Man again, we'll all be socialist by default. So everything will work out and we'll have this utopia. And on the woke right, it's in fact that there is an ideal national form, like literally a platonic ideal of what your nation is supposed to be. And when we can get the right people in control who can return the nation to its form, or as with the Nazis, use eugenics and force and Darwinian approaches of competition in order to perfect humanity into what it's supposed to be. See, Hitler talked a lot about the Aryans and the Germans, but he actually believed that the Germans had to be remade into a more perfect Aryan nation that was more racially pure, that was strengthened even beyond the normal confines of humanity into superhumanity, and that would be a culture able to produce even higher, not just arts, but also warfare, and thus conquer the world for the better and take humanity to its next phases. So it's either that you're going to restore the nation as it should be, or you're going to restore the national object, the ideal of the nation as it should have been, such that it can progress forward to a human idealized endpoint. The point being that they're both idealist systems. They're not realist systems. They don't believe that reality is out there for all of us. They believe that they have special insight into the ideal realm of what's supposed to make a society work. So as political idealists, if they are put into power, since they have a grasp of the political ideal, they are elites, and they will be able to lead us to a golden age that's in line with what the ideal society is supposed to look like. Or in the case of the woke left in particular, what this ideal society would not look like. No class struggle, no racism, no sexism. They don't know what the actual communism looks like. They just know what it doesn't have.
Right, great stuff. And when it comes to say, so exactly, yeah, there's like this utopian kind of fantasy ideas on either side of the equation here. And when you're talking about the woke right, just to kind of drag you into the political side of things, I suppose, I think we're kind of dealing with this a little bit in Ireland as well, too, James. It's probably not as pronounced as in other countries, I don't think. And it's certainly more obvious in the States with the big personalities involved that have been talked about as being woke right and so on. I presume that Americans who fit into this category or any big figures could be kind of regarded as like probably buying into the idea perhaps that America has been the oppressor on a global stage, or they're kind of, is it fair to say that they might be a little bit anti-American in their kind of outlook somehow?
Yeah, but it's not exactly like that. You do hear that now. It's actually been a little bit surprising. Tucker Carlson coming out and saying that the reason that what's going on in the Middle East is because of, colonial oppression or whatever, sounding exactly like a person on the left. But so they have an ideal America, but the problems are the way that they look at it is opposite. On the left, the view is that we have been insufficiently tolerant, so therefore cannot unlock our full potential. And on the right, it has been that we've been too tolerant and therefore have polluted our true potential. So those actually are same idea pointing in opposite directions. So what they are both hostile to the America that exists in reality. They are both critical of the America that exists in reality compared to an ideal. But it's not so much the way, an easier way to maybe phrase it would be that the woke left says, look, the world is ordered by oppression and that's bad. Whereas, and then a very woke way of dealing with it, the class struggle, etc. And then the woke right says the world is ordered by oppression and that's good. That's how it's natural. It's actually how things are supposed to work. And because we are not able to oppress any longer, we have corruption and pollution. So we should be able to become the oppressors. Of course, the left is also becoming the oppressors in their socialization thesis because they believe that they have to re-socialize everybody to be socialists. But that's only like semi-contradictory when you understand what what their goals and mindset are. They're like reluctant oppressors, actually, because their goal is to transform people to where there's no need for governance at all. It's just a fake goal. They can't achieve it. But on the right, it's different. On the right, all this stuff is going wrong. And if we would just cracked skulls, we wouldn't have these problems. That's the mentality. And cracking skulls, they'll tell you, if you read Mein Kampf, it's in there. If you read some of the very modern literature or listen to the guys online, if we crack skulls, that's very natural. That's just the law of nature, the survival of the fittest and the victory of the strongest. So that's what we really should be doing. So they are critical of America, but for opposite reasons. America is not open and tolerant enough for the left, and it's been a bad actor on the world stage, of course. And then that's where they actually kind of meet, is in this foreign policy, but for slightly different reasons. On the right, though, it's that America has been too open, too tolerant, and a bad actor on the world stage as well, so that we have to close down more and actually step into a more oppression given model. Over in Ireland or UK or Europe, it's more complicated in a way, because the problem that you guys are primarily facing that's radicalizing you, besides some heavy socialism in your government, is a migrant problem. And so there is a real issue of a undeniable clash of cultures, and thus the real question of cultural hegemony, or in a sense, cultural multipolarity within a single country. And the idea that's being put up is that, they call it multiculturalism or whatever, but the idea is that, I wouldn't necessarily say it's by default woke right thinking, is that maybe some cultural chauvinism is not such a bad thing. Maybe it's okay to be Irish and being proud of Irish history and what being Irish has meant in a traditional historical form, without having to apologize for it all the time. Like, there's certainly a lot of fruit there, but it's very easy to go into this kind of, as they call it in American slang, at least, Wignat territory, this radical territory, where this chauvinism turns into supremacism, and even this desire to completely overthrow the system in order to establish. Again, the key is that you're going to establish your own rule. It's basically like it'll be better if we're in charge, trust me, bro, of philosophies. So you're going to establish your own rule, usually with an iron fist, because you believe you know what society ideally should look like, and nobody else gets it, and therefore has to be crushed. So that it's harder to parse this. I think in America it's a little easier to parse than in countries like Ireland, for example, because the problem is so blatantly that you are facing two or more cultures that are in direct conflict with a government that's telling you to shut up and deal with it when it's clearly not working, and that the problems that it generates are swept under the rug only on one side of the issue, which is very radicalizing on the one hand, but it's also a very clear and present problem that requires something like a cultural chauvinism to be able to solve it. There's the fundamental incompatibility of Islam and Western cultures. Any other culture, it doesn't even have to be Western. If you injected Islam into China, you have a similar problem. It is fundamentally incompatible with that other culture. And that could be ancient China, which wasn't communist, or present day China, which is communist. It's completely incompatible because it's a militant ideology that seeks to have its own complete hegemony. So anyway, it's more complicated there. You do have some elements of the problem, but the justification for them is better. Most of my perspective in speaking is a very American perspective, because I'm very American and I'm trying to deal with this problem in America, where the Republican Party is being imminently threatened by it from within. And I think most of the rest of the reasonable world understands that if the American conservatives go woke too, and America starts coming apart, that pretty soon we're all going to be China's slaves anyway. So my perspective is a little America-centric in terms of how it applies. It's more complicated in across Europe, including the British Isles.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that keeping that integrity, because obviously, as we talked about, Marxism is very good at derailing opposition and contaminating its opposition. We have to try to keep this, sensible ideological stance, whatever we want to call it, patriotism or nationalism, whatever is the most effective, without going overboard, and keeping itself nice and insulated from any influences or bad ideas and so on. And actually, when you talked about Europe there, of course you're dead right. I mean, even someone who's just recently become switched on to global affairs or the way the West has been changing, you can see that mass immigration is like the existential threat to Western European countries and elsewhere. And I don't know if you've dealt with this problem as well in the States. I deal with it talking to people about Marxism. They tend to put it in a box too quickly, and they might go, "Oh yeah, you mean the woke stuff?" Well, yeah, that's correct. That's part of it, but as you know, it's massive. There's the economic side of Marxism. There's the geopolitical side of it, like you mentioned, the regimes with communism in their DNA, like Russia, North Korea, China, and their allies, etc. I mean, is this a problem you deal with as well? You're talking to people. I mean, also there's the World Economic Forum, the United Nations. They all seem to come from the same ideology. How do you deal with that? People want to put it in a little box, but it's absolutely massive, isn't it?
No, you actually have to put it in the bigger box. You have to explain that this is a what's happening, for example, in Europe, but also in America, but also in Australia, and anywhere you want to turn. Um, at least across what is generally referred to as Western nations, is a current in one river. And that river has a destination. It's going somewhere. You could say it dumps out into the sea at a certain point. And the ugly part of the story is that point that it dumps out into, if you can see, is where was my finger going? China. I could do this. There we go. China. China's dominance in the world is it's hard to do that inverse, but China's dominance in the world economically and politically is actually the intended target of all of the entities that you just named. And so they are funding a lot of this. China's got some provisional deal with Russia through BRICS. So they're obviously, of course, they've been messing around with Europe, especially the energy stuff, for decades. It's very, very bad. And then, of course, the Islamic world, which is looped directly in. This is why this Iran conflict is so important in a global political circumstances. Among everything else that Iran and that regime represent, it is a key hub. Turkey as well, key hubs in China's Belt and Road Initiative. If you want to get goods and services from Asia, because you can't cross the Himalayas, and if you don't want to go through Russia, if you want to get them to Middle East, Africa, or Europe, you're going through Iran and Turkey. Period. End of discussion. You have to go through them. So that's the land routes. The other routes are the sea routes, and those either are going to go partially half land, half sea, where you come up through the Strait of Hormuz and you go to the Iranian ports, and then you're on the land route into those same locations, or you go up the other side of the Arabian Peninsula and you go through the Suez Canal into the Mediterranean, at which point you have sea access to Europe and North Africa, or to go out into the Atlantic to come over to the Americas. Okay, so that's three key pathways, three key corridors through which the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative operates. And the goal that the Chinese have is very explicit with that. The CCP wishes to be in economic control of the affairs of what they said is 5.8 billion people, which would be all of Europe, all of Africa, all of the Middle East, all of Asia, and then the Oceania regions. So only the Americas would be separate from direct economic control, and it'd be kind of hit or miss in South America, and allow North America to figure out what it wants to do. Canada's already signed on with China as far as that goes. So who knows? So maybe America would be completely isolated, puts a different spin on this America only idea. Maybe that's really America isolated and is a loser position that benefits China. But you can't talk about what's happening with all of this including the mass immigration, this bigger picture program that all of these entities you named are supporting, without recognizing their relevance to the rising economic and then political hegemony of the CCP through the world, which is a bigger program with tons of money, tons of political operation behind it all over the planet, tons of deals. The World Economic Forum, for example, has been in league with China since 1978. Like literally a few years after its own inception, it was making deals with Deng Xiaoping as soon as he came into power. It didn't do so well making deals with Mao Zedong, but once Mao was out of the way and Deng Xiaoping took the chairmanship in 78, you have Klaus Schwab having a meeting in China. He was trying to get Deng Xiaoping to come to Davos, but he wouldn't come, so that they established a World Economic Forum meeting in China. It stopped being called the European Management Forum and switched to the World Economic Forum, particularly because of its integration with Chinese affairs in the late 70s and early 80s. So a lot of people don't know that there's this giant relationship there. There's huge financial relationships. And that's key to understanding what's going on. Those relationships exist in the Middle East. The Middle East doesn't want to be, to use President Trump's phrasing for it, a bunch of shithole countries. These countries want to thrive. They have crazy money. They have money pouring out of the ground in absurd quantities, whether it's liquid natural gas, whether it's oil, at least pouring out of the ground in absurd quantities. They're very wealthy nations. You can see what they do. You go to look at Dubai, you look at some of the projects in Saudi Arabia, you look at the things that they're building. It's unbelievable what they can put that money, not to say that they're good places, but what they can put that money to. They want a thriving population. Well, what's the problem? They're full of radical lunatics. How do you, and they can have this great relationship with China, by the way, if they're a thriving, they're the middle of this economic corridor. They're at the dead center. They're at the crossroads, as a matter of fact. Iran is the crossroads. Everybody knows that one of the best places to be, and this is one of the reasons the Islamic world was able to grow so successfully early on, is that Mecca is very close to a crossroads of the entire old world. Well, so is Iran. So Tehran could be considered at a point of very close to the crossroads of the whole world. The whole Arabian Peninsula is dead in the middle of this whole thing. They stand to make so much money, be so successful, be so powerful and important on the world stage. Problem is they have all these idiots that'll blow anything up that you try to build. What do you do with them? Send them to Sweden. Send them to Ireland. Send them to Germany. The stupid idiots in Europe, with their stupid openness policy and their post-colonial guilt, will just bring in millions of these lunatics. You clean out the Middle East. The Middle East becomes thriving, well, not industrial, but like commercial superpowers on the crossroads of the world's largest economic corridor. All you have to do is get the lunatics out. So why are they importing so many people into Europe? Well, because Europe's at the end of the road. It doesn't matter nearly as much. It's not exactly been growing or thriving in decades because of its choking itself with socialism. So who cares really what they do? You don't have the British Empire being this massive economic power anymore because empire is over. So who cares? And so we'll just deport all of the lunatics to the edge of the empire and let them go screw it up or do whatever they want to do. Let them freeze in the winter or whatever. And the rest of the thing is going to just go gangbusters. So you start to see this whole plan in a very different way when you start to understand that the goal was clean up the Middle East, turn it into an economic powerhouse at the crossroads of the Belt and Road Initiative for China. And who cares what happens to Europe? Plus, they had it coming anyway. Screw them. And so Europe is over. Let them go. So when you look at it in terms of what actual kind of global projects are happening with the target date of, say, 2050-ish, or maybe even 2100, you start to actually understand that what's happening to Europe is Europe is basically like the garbage pit of this entire project, where you get rid of the junk so that you can progress forward with what you want to do. You can't turn Africa into that, because you have to mine Africa. You have to steal everything Africa has. Africa becomes like the pantry and not the pantry. That's going to be like Ukraine, but it's the minerals. It's the mine. So you can't like pollute Africa with more lunatic warlords. You can't get anything done. So what? What does Europe have? What are the Germans bringing to the table? Beer. You can brew beer anywhere now. So this is an ugly story, but this is what's happening to Europe actually on the big picture. So when you start saying, oh, this small piece or that small piece, it's like you're missing this giant transformation of the entire world, which depends upon China rising and the rest of the world saying, okay, that's fine. You're the big dog on the block now, which basically also the other piece of that is shrinking the United States and its influence, cutting it off from its allies. The West, it writ large, has no freaking idea there's two sets of people in the West. There are all of us who don't really know what's actually going on and what the goal is and why we're killing ourselves by, in particular, fighting with each other and importing all of these we call them migrants. They're not migrants. They are we're becoming the penal colony of the Middle East. Meanwhile, other people, the elites with a diacritical marker or whatever over the e, the elites, those people, the World Economic Forum elites, the elite people who have to put an accent on their e, those people know exactly what the hell they're doing, and they're the ones selling our countries to that project, getting stinking rich, and are assured nice places to live in the future program. And then people ask questions like, why would Tucker Carlson buy a house in Doha? I'm like, start putting some pieces together. If he works for the program, he has a nice bug out place where either the political situation, his criminal situation, or the economic situation in America goes south, he has a place to go. Where? At the rich super crossroads of the world. Why is he given permission to do that? Because he's working for it. And stuff starts starting. It just kind of starts making sense all of a sudden. It's not as mysterious thing. And James, is that a conspiracy theory? No, the Chinese want to take over the world. Not complicated. The Muslims want their share. They're not going to just give up on it. So here's the deal. I mean, it's kind of like written out, and it's very clear what's happening from this bigger picture. So no, you can't put this in small boxes. You can't think of, it's just this woke thing. All these people went crazy. They didn't go crazy. They bought into a different program that turns out not to care about you or your life.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why it's so frustrating doing this job, trying to spread awareness about Marxism and how big it is and potentially complex it is, arguably, and there's all these different facets to it. People aren't willing to start even with the basics. I mean, I don't think they quite understand what's coming down the tracks. I'm 100% in agreement that when you join the dots of all these internationalist organizations, and then also we got the CCP involved and their allies too. I mean, clearly the vultures are kind of circling the carcass. It looks like, I don't think it's a coincidence that after decades of cultural Marxism or whatever weakening Western nations, that now we have this communist alliance on the horizon is starting to get more belligerent. It's amazing that people can't really see this. And so much to talk about. I don't want to keep you too long, James. We're coming up to the 2-hour mark as well. I don't want to keep you too late. I want to get on with your day and so on. But it's been great speaking to you. Very, very educational. You have a tremendous amount of knowledge, of course. I hope the viewers are going to be inspired by what you're saying, and check out the website as well, newdiscourses.com, and the YouTube channel. Anything you'd like to add before we finish up here, say with regards to anything, or what would you recommend? Where should people start with this stuff?
I mean, I hate to do this, like to promote myself. I'd rather promote other things. But I do think people should probably start looking at my website if they're trying to get their head around some of these pieces. I have short form things. I have long form things. The ones with the bullet on them are short. That's a pun. I use a bullet because they're like short little bursts of information. So they try to stay around 20 minutes or less. The longer ones are sometimes very long. But you can hear like how I have basically, if you go through those things in order chronologically, which is a big lift now, there's like 500 of them, you will find out that you will see the development of my thinking as I've done more reading, as I've put pieces together, as I've had conversations and seen different things, and some places where I've been right and wrong. And I've tried to lay this all out very clearly for people. I obviously make a ton of reading recommendations, and a lot of my podcasts actually involve me reading original sources to people. I strongly recommend engaging with original sources whenever possible. Like, if you haven't read the Communist Manifesto, maybe you should. If we're, maybe it's time. If you don't want to, I read most of it to you in 2 podcasts on my channel, because I realized nobody will read some of this stuff. If you've never read Mein Kampf, it's 500 and something unpleasant pages. Maybe it's time.
It's quite a read,
Yeah, he's a angry, rambling kind of guy. It's not a very pleasant read. And I just mean that in a literary sense, besides the subject matter being terrible. He's just like, even Mussolini criticized his writing, which apparently pissed him off.
I think it was, wasn't it dictated to Rudolf Hess in Landsberg prison, and I wonder maybe that was something why the grammar and stuff was so bad, and like my concentration span isn't that great. If someone starts a sentence and it's still going for the whole paragraph with no punctuation, I have to go back to the beginning and remember how he started. It's quite a read, but yeah, there is so much. I mean, that's part of the challenge I think we have, James, is because you know yourself with the way society's changed. This is an old story, but it's still a big problem, and we're in the age of, people want the quick fix constantly. They don't have the concentration spans they used to. How do we take something so complex and present it to them in a simple way? I think that's part of the challenge. But James, I love what you do. Best of luck with everything going forward. I hope more and more people listen to you, absolutely. But thanks very much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. This has been a good conversation.
No worries. Thanks, James. Thank you. Okay, folks, there you have it. The great James Lindsay, that brilliant interaction, and so much knowledge. He's very, very good at what he does. You should follow the man's advice. Check out his YouTube channel. No one's too busy to check out the bullets for starters, and get stuck into it. This is an investment. Whatever you call yourself, patriot, anti-globalist, nationalist, whatever you are, if you're concerned about what's going on in the world, as I've been saying for ages, you really have to get stuck into learning about Marxism. You're gonna see things through a whole different perspective, and it's really a fascinating time to be alive. But people can't see this, even with the war and the conflict on the bigger picture scale, or the woke stuff, or the economic stuff, climate change, trans, BLM, radical feminism, everything, you name it, it all ties back into this subject. So thank you very much, folks. I will see you in the next one. Make sure you check out the website newdiscourses.com. So thank you, and I will see you soon.